Margaret O'Callaghan, my far right, is historian and political analyst at the School of Politics, International Studies and Philosophy at Queen's. And she's written extensively on such topics as the careers of Richard Pigott, Roger Casement and Tom Kettle, the RIC, the Fringe Fenian Press, Belfast in the 60s and 70s, and most crucial, I think, to our discussion this evening, she's edited and contributed to this book, 1916 and 1966, commemorating the Easter Rising. Well worth a look. Next up, Kevin Rooney, who's co-author of this book, which in many ways is the animating spirit of this debate. The book is called Who's Afraid of the Easter Rising, co-written with James Hartfield, who I'm glad to say is also with us. It's really well worth a read. Like I say, when I call it the animating spirit, in a way it addresses the issues that I thought nobody was going to address in this discussion, and it was, I think, what inspired myself and the Salon's co-founder Brett Becker to have the debate in the first place. He teaches politics and is head of social science at Queen's School near Watford, and he's written in a range of publications on education, politics, Irish current affairs and football, and keeps, what's the blog called?
Fans for Freedom. I'm a mad Celtic fan.
How do you think they're going to fare out over in Bosnia this evening?
Okay. This really is what the debate is about, isn't it? Okay, next up is Derek Molyneux, writer and historian. He's from Dublin, extensive knowledge, as I spoke to him earlier, about Dublin streets and areas, based on having been a motorcycle courier.
20 years, yeah.
20 years. He's also a brilliant historian of place and of Dublin itself. I don't have a copy of the book to hand, but it's over there.
When the clock struck in 1916.
When the clock struck in 1916. Next up is Anthony McIntyre, to my right. Former IRA volunteer, ex-prisoner, 18 years in Long Kesh. He's the author of the Good Friday Agreement, The Death of Irish Republicanism, and the Good Friday Agreement is more or less, be fair to say, marks the parting of the ways with republicanism for you.
Mm-hmm.
Fair enough. Without further ado, we'll kick off. The format briefly, everyone's going to speak for 5 to 7 minutes, right? These yellow and red cards. Yellow for 6 minutes, red for stop right now. So
It's great with the football being on tonight as well.
Well, exactly, yeah. We're really not going to get away from that. But anyway, in the order I mentioned, then we might have a roundtable discussion depending on what comes up here. But most importantly, we want to get out to hear your contributions as quickly as possible, because that's really what gives every Dublin Salon event its impetus and its force. So, Margaret?
Hi, I'm going to begin. We're talking for 5 minutes, but we're having a long discussion and coming in repeatedly afterwards, Justin, yeah?
Pretty much.
Okay, so I'll just try and say how I got interested in this, the kind of research we did, what we found out, and what I'm still doing on it, and we'll take it from there. I'm interested in 1916 itself, and at the moment I'm still working on Roger Casement, and I'm writing about a woman called Alice Stopford Green, who Casement, MacNeill and many others thought was a very important historian for the revolutionary generation. So I'm kind of looking at that. But how did I get into this in the first place? About 10 years ago, it was obvious that there was going to be a lot of talk about how 1916 would be commemorated in 2016. And with Mary Daly, who lectured in history in UCD and is now the first female president of the Royal Irish Academy, we did a research project really saying what actually did happen when the Rising was commemorated in 1966. Now you could say, why did we bother to ask that question, since every time you open the newspaper, really from the 70s onwards, from the height of the Troubles, we were constantly told that it was how the Irish government commemorated the Easter Rising in 1966 that rebaptised a new generation, that it was influential in Northern Ireland, which I don't know if Anthony would agree, I would think probably disagree with. But I suppose what you could call the central revisionist line in interpretation of modern Irish history from the 70s onwards argued that somehow the 1966 commemoration and the way that the Irish government in particular had chosen to commemorate it had been a contributory factor to quote unquote starting the Troubles in the North. So Conor Cruise O'Brien's argument was really based about what the Dublin government did, what the government of the Republic did, and really what they did in the 26 counties. So because I'm based in Belfast, I thought, well, everybody talks about the impact of 66 on the North, but has anyone actually looked at what happened in the North in 66? Okay. So I'll talk about the North in 66 first, and then I'll say something about Lemass's government and what they thought they were up to. I suppose what I found interesting about the North in 66 was Lemass's government wanted to commemorate the Rising. But why do they want to commemorate the Rising? Because they were the government, because there was electoral votes in it, because De Valera was standing for the presidency, and because also commemoration they felt was the state's duty. They also felt that if they didn't do it, so-called subversives would do it. So if you go back to the 20s, 30s, if you look at the biography of somebody like Rory O'Brody, you'll see that those who I call Republicans outside the state, or the Department of Justice would call subversives, or people who are in the IRA, commemoration was a huge and central part of their kind of public culture. So in 66, the Irish state wanted to make sure that it controlled the running of 66. Well and good if all these little Republican groups wanted to do their own commemorations in their own way, the state would stamp it. What Mary Daly, who worked on the southern stuff, really ended up concluding was that Lemass's government were incredibly conscious of the North in 66. They didn't want to offend O'Neill's government. They were quite cautious if you actually go through the papers in terms of how they commemorated it. So there's kind of a discrepancy between their intention and how it's remembered. And I think what we kind of concluded in the introduction to this book, or it's my belief, the cultural capital of Irish Republican memory, whether you agree or disagree with it, was at the centre of the Easter Rising itself in 1916. The text of the proclamation is a way of re-articulating that. So once you're commemorating the Easter Rising, governments can't control it fully in the way in which they wish to. Okay? So Roisin Higgins, who's also written about this, has said Lemass kind of wants to commemorate the Rising, but he wants to keep the violence out of it. He wanted to say every generation has its task, we're commemorating it in 66, but we're doing it so Ireland will economically do well. So what was happening in the North at the same time? Well, I suppose people like Sean Garland, Tomás McGilla, Goulding, that end of the IRA Sinn Féin, went into Belfast in 65, 66 and kind of put it up to a core number of kind of old guys who'd been maybe in prison or interned a couple of decades earlier, and their message kind of was, are you men or mice? Is it going to be any proper command? Are you going to do anything up here for 66? Now I'm not suggesting that it was all dictated by people like McGilla going into West Belfast, but they did, I think, help to organise some circles around Republican clubs. So you had they were the only people commemorating 66 in the North. The GAA was commemorating, local groups were, the official nationalist opposition in the North were really scared of it. So they would have rather do what Lemass wanted and just came down south. I've also looked at commemoration, sorry I'm really jumping this now, but I've got my yellow card. I've also looked at commemoration in 76. By 76 in Dublin, commemorating the Rising, who's afraid of commemorating 1916? Most Irish governments since 1973 is the answer to that question. Okay? And 76 is a particularly, from about 72, 73, Conor Cruise O'Brien has been trying to say we should stop commemorating the Rising. We should just have a national day, a St. Patrick's Day, 1 or 2 days in the year. That's fine. Just stop this rising stuff. Stop pushing the proclamation. And I think Conor Cruise O'Brien, who was a brilliant historian, had a very astute sense of what he called how ghosts could walk. Now, he thought you could control it, but I think he thought government could control things, okay? But I think that once you're commemorating and once you put information out there and once you give people access to it, governments can't really control very much. But in 73, in Dublin, I suppose you had a clash. It was the nadir moment for a particular wing within the provisional IRA. People like O'Connell and O'Brady, it marked their end. They tried to put a huge display on in Dublin in 76 because the state was doing a minimal official commemoration. So it was the height, if you like, of the coalition government's clamp down on the provos at that time. So I'll leave it at that and say more in the discussion.
Excellent, thanks Margaret. Kevin?
Guys, can I just assert lots of things because I've only got 5 minutes. First of all, just 1 minute on the book that James and I wrote, and then another 4 minutes on a couple of other things. The first thing that the book says that we wrote is hatred's a good thing, antagonism is a good thing. It's good to hate British imperialism or colonialism. It's good to hate unionism, and it's good to hate partition. And if people disagree with that, that's great. We can have a good fight. The second thing is that it's very bizarre that people in the Free State, the politicians here, seem so lukewarm about the Rising. When you think of people across the world, in Africa and Asia, who were inspired, anti-colonialists right across the world were inspired by the Rising, and you look to our own backyard here and you see the comparison, and that tells me something interesting. It tells me about a sense of self-loathing. I think the third thing is that there's no moral equivalence. Irish Republicans who fought for an independent Ireland and against the barbarism of the First World War were the goodies. They were the good people. They fought a noble cause. Irishmen who fought for Britain fought for the wrong country. They died for the wrong cause. And it needs to be said very clearly. I have absolutely no sympathy for them. And you don't hear that very often because you're not allowed to say it in the current orthodoxy. And the other thing that the book says is that the history of the last 100 years is the history of the Free State government trying to control 1916 commemorations, of trying to marginalise real Republicans who try to honour the actual goals and aspirations and ideals of 1916. And finally, the book talks about the bad faith of Free State politicians who tug the forelock, who go out and commemorate 1916 on Easter Sunday, but absolutely have no intention of trying to pursue in any shape, form or fashion a united Ireland, an end to partition, or any of the radicalism or vision that the men of 1916 and women of 1916 stood for. And so that's the book. Okay, so hard choices. I think in social and historical moments, people have to make moral and political choices. And the rebels of 1916 did that, and if it's not clear already, let me say now, I admire them, I'm with them 100%. Of course you can always have tactical and strategic discussions about possible mistakes that were made, etc. But you know, the main thing is that I'm with them, James and I are with them 100%. Not only did they challenge colonialism and occupation of our country, but very importantly, they challenged the barbarism of the First World War. And in that sense, the Easter Rising was an anti-war war. This is something a lot of people forget. Redmond, who marched tens of thousands of Irishmen to be slaughtered in the fields of Flanders and elsewhere, and also marched Irishmen to slaughter Germans and others. And Connolly and McDermott and the rest of them were attempting in the GPO to challenge the barbarism and imperialism of that war, and that's something I think we need to insert into the centenary discussions. Second thing, I have no problem I have no problem with people who disagree with me. I have a degree of respect for John Bruton when he says the Easter Rising damaged the Irish psyche. Completely disagree with him. I think he's wrong, I think he's mad, but fair enough, because he calls a spade a spade. I have no problem with Paul Bew, who we debated 2 weeks ago, when he says the rebels lacked democratic legitimacy, it was undemocratic rising. I think he's wrong, but that's not a problem. We can have a debate. I could go on, and I could talk about revisionist historians, or I could talk about Dudley Edwards, who we debated recently, who said that the rebels were sectarian. The point is that they nail their colours to the mast, and you have the space for an honest debate. I think all of them were wrong, but my point is we need a bit of honesty and integrity in the discussion about the Easter Rising. Contrast that to the Don't Mention the War video. How many people remember the video Ireland Inspires? What a joke, what an embarrassment that not one man or woman of the Rising was mentioned. And we had Google and Facebook and Paisley and I forget your friggin' man's name. Who's the Prime Minister of Britain again?
David Cameron.
David Cameron, excuse me for a second. So all of these people are getting mentioned. I mean, what's going on? Jesus, what's going on here? Something seriously profound is going on. And my point is, it tells you something about the rulers of this state. Now, there was a backlash, and so they moved to put on a whole series of events. But if you look, what really strikes you about Charlie Flanagan and Heather Humphreys and Enda Kenny and the President Michael Higgins when they speak about 1916? It's all this talk about pluralism, all this talk about 1916 belongs to everyone, all this talk about shared past, shared future in relation to Unionists in the North celebrating the Ulster Covenant or the Somme, and talking about the Irishmen who fought for Britain in the First World War should be remembered equally with the rebels in the GPO. It all sounds good. So what they're effectively doing is closing down the space for debate. They don't want there to be antagonism. They don't want there to be hatred. But we need that. We need hatred. If you think partition or occupation of our country or World War I was a problem, we need to call a spade a spade. But we're not having that discussion. And the reason why we wrote the book and what I'm saying here is, at the very, very least, we may not win the argument, but we need to have that debate and that discussion. I've already got the yellow card, so I'm going to have to skip massively. But I just really want to say, there is no moral equivalence between an Irishman who wore a British uniform and an Irishman who wanted to challenge British rule in our country. And that is absolutely fundamental. And when you talk about individual suffering, it sounds nice and touchy-feely, but you rob people of their agency. You rob them of political meaning and dignity and why they set out to fight and die. Or do we not think politics or agency matters anymore? Because that's effectively what's happening. We have this almost therapeutic approach to politics today and remembering the Rising. And also, you see, I want to go further and really pick a fight. I mean, the top-selling book about 40 children who were killed in the Easter Rising. Of course, I feel sorry for for the civilians and the children. Do you not smell a rat? Is it only me that smells a rat? That's where we're at, where we think the discussion that we need to have is about civilians and children. Of course we can discuss them. But what does that tell us about the men and women who made history, who went out, put their lives on the line to challenge the barbarism of the First World War, which in turn inspired people across the world, from Lenin to Ho Chi Minh? Connolly's writings, and Dan Breen's writings later, translated into Punjabi, Urdu, Hindi, lots of languages I can't even remember off the top of my head, inspired by Republicans, by our fight for freedom. And we have this perverse scenario right now where we want to wrap it up in this touchy-feely language. And if you speak like me, you're labelled a wrecker of the peace process. You're labelled divisive. We need to challenge that orthodoxy which is at play right now. And my final point. The Easter Rising wasn't about state legitimacy. The 26 counties is the bastard state. Connolly and McDermott did not go out to fight for a partition state. So when I see these people somehow making the link between the radical, bold visions of the men and women of 1916 and what they fought and stood for, to somehow legitimising this 26-county state, I do not accept it. I'll leave it there.
Tell us what you really think, Kevin. That's what Dublin Stand is all about, robust free speech. Thank you very much, Kevin. Derek?
Was the Easter Rising needless death? Of course it was needless death. All war is needless death. Any conflict always results in needless death. Was Edward Carson's importation of the guns in back in 1912, 1914, was that a cue for needless death? It absolutely was. Was the Battle of the Somme needless death? Of course it was. Were the civilian casualties who died when the Allies invaded northern France in 1944 needless death? Absolutely. At this stage of its evolution, the human race doesn't appear to have gotten over the need to kill each other when they have differences. It's just something that we appear to be stuck with. War is incredibly wrong, but the world is still now trying to blow itself up in places like Syria and elsewhere. I can't understand it, but it appears that we're stuck with it. But Ireland seems to have this need to beat itself up over what happened in Dublin in 1916. Now, I don't do politics, I never have, but I mean, I respect some of the views that I've heard here, and they've been very, very well articulated, and I would actually agree with quite a few of them. But I have to say that, I mean, we need to stop beating ourselves up over this. From a purely historical point of view, this is an incredibly fascinating episode in our history, where you had people who, while we were researching this book, I mean, they drew us into their stories, their sufferings, their pure courage. I mean, I'll go back to the point of, the needless deaths. Talking about Joe Duffy's book about the 40-odd kids who were killed in the Easter Rising. How many children died every year in the slums of Dublin? I'll tell you how many. 60% of children in Dublin's slums died before the age of 10. In 1917, a British Army major was commissioned by Trinity College to carry out a study into infant mortality in Dublin. And he was shocked when he concluded that the troops that he was commanding in the Western Front had a better chance of surviving than children growing up in Dublin's slums. Where is their memorial? That's what it is. Needless death, it's you had other sort of, there's so many statistics I could pull out of the 1911 census to show just how dangerous Dublin was as a place to live back in those days for a myriad of reasons to do with the governance of the city. In fairness, you had an Irish, local government under a British system, but ultimately it was a system that was causing these deaths. Now, the people who went out, and we'll hear it time and time again that they shouldn't have done it, they shouldn't have declared a war in a city because inevitably civilians are going to be put in harm's way. These civilians were already in harm's way, but to the people who are preaching this and saying that we shouldn't have done this, should they have bombed Caen in Normandy in 1944 when the RAF, because they couldn't dislodge the Germans from that city, sent 1,500 Lancaster bombers over, and in doing so they killed 5,000 French civilians. Now, those French civilians, they may have died, but at least they were liberated from the Nazis. But the thing is, are the British beating themselves up over that year on year? No, they're not. They celebrate it the whole campaign as a military victory, for better or for worse. Now, I'm not condemning nor condoning that. I'm a military history. I find everything like that fascinating, from the Normans to the Romans to God knows who. And we have this here. We had this epic military confrontation where a very, very small selection of people who, the history says that, they weren't very well trained. I would beg to differ. They were exceptionally well trained, and a lot of British who came here actually found that out to their great expense. They were arrogant and they underestimated them, and they got a hell of a bloody nose for it. But this all went on in the few square miles that we have of Dublin city centre. You have North King Street, which is referred to as Ireland's mini Stalingrad because of the sheer ferocity of what went on down there. You had Ireland's Thermopylae at Mount Street Bridge, where 13 Republicans held off the best part of 2,000 soldiers in the form of 2 battalions of the Sherwood Foresters, but in doing so they actually held up the best part of the British division. They did this for 9 hours. Now, why the hell aren't we shouting this out to the world from the point of view of tourism? Look at Moore Street, look at the frenetic battle that went on down there. I mean, this is the sort of stuff that, I haven't seen any sort of dramatisation on any conflict that would do justice to what went on within this city. And So some of the points that were raised here about, you know, governments being uncomfortable about the whole, you know, post 1922, I would agree. I don't do politics, but I mean it's blatantly obvious to me as a historian that, you know, you'd have to be ridiculously stupid not to realise that the governments who have been in power here since 1922, they probably have an inferiority complex to do with the 1916 proclamation, because they've ultimately failed miserably in cherishing all the children of the nation equally. You know, we all know that. So I'm sure this isn't something that they want to go around, you know, having the proclamation, you know, thrown in front of everybody's faces. And I would dare say that there is an agenda there that doesn't really want to go out and broadcast this. But for God's sake, Ireland, get up off your arse and tell the feckin' world what went on here, because it's a gripping and incredibly interesting story. This is when we stood up, rightly or wrongly. A couple of thousand people went out and they took on the world's biggest empire that the sun never set on, and it was next door. They did it with antiquated weapons, and they did what they did. I mean, I was only saying earlier on about everyone, you know, remembers the film Zulu, you know, the famous Battle of Rorke's Drift, where, you know, the British Army lauds itself. No, I mean, well done, you know, fantastic. You know, 120 odd men held off 4,000 Zulus. Now, in fairness, 100 odd men were armed with very modern weapons. Most of the Zulus, they would have been lucky to have bows and arrows. But you come to, you do the maths, then you've got 13 holding off the best part of 2,000. You know, the ratio is a hell of a lot less when it comes to the Republicans. And at Mount Street Bridge, it was the Republicans who were armed with the antiquated weapons. But you have such a tapestry of stories. You have the human stories, and Ireland is probably the only country in the world. Now, we do so much wrong in Ireland. You know, we're always hitting ourselves for that one. But this thing that they had in the 1940s and the 1950s of getting all these volunteers in and recording all their stories. I've spoken to Polish people who have mentioned what went on in Warsaw in 1944, and they would give their right arms to have the information that we have in relation to what people set out to do, what they were prepared to do, what they died and injured themselves doing. And I think we owe them, whatever you think of their beliefs, you know, they weren't evil people. You might not have agreed with their method. I'm sure they were as flawed as the rest of us. But they went out and did what they did, men and women. And by bloody God, will you get up and start feckin' be proud of yourself. I'm sorry, but that's how I feel about this. I'm sick of being in Ireland where we have this goddamn inferiority complex and feel that we should beat ourselves up because we stood up for ourselves.
Thanks very much, Derek. Anthony?
Thanks. I'd like to welcome Damien and Cho here from the Independent Workers Union for the meeting of the Independent Workers Union the other night. I heard this thing about a timeline Nazi. I'm going to be a timeline, and that's what's a timeline Nazi, but a time Nazi and stick to the 5 minutes. And that's why I prepared something written rather than just did speak at the top of my head, because I tend to ramble. It is hardly news. Memory wars have always taken place. In the blurb for the Erna Paris book, Long Shadows, Truth Lies in History, the claim is made that how countries manipulate historical memory is one of the most urgent issues facing the world today. Perhaps an overstatement given wars, refugee crisis and climate change, but certainly in terms of our cultural and intellectual world the charge stands. Which is pretty much what draws us together this evening. And even Eventbrite flyer for this gathering, the question was posed, is it possible to rescue the meaning of the Easter Rising from this one-size-fits-all commemorative sentimentality? That ascribes to the Rising an essentialism that overlooks the fact that meaning is often positional rather than fixed. Meanings, as Derrida suggested, are not endless. But there is never only one, and as suggested by Foucault, often the extent to which a history may become dominant is the extent to which it manages to suppress alternative histories. At the same time, Derrida made the point that politics is a privileged space for the lie, and there have been quite a few lies told about the Rising. This has its roots in Hannah Arendt's observation that the most radical revolutionary will become the conservative the day after the revolution. The choice seems simple enough. Grasped by Camus, it amounts to every revolutionary become an elder, an oppressor or a heretic, and it invariably arises out of the fidelity to today rather than yesterday, which is why, frequently enough, history is, in the words of Paris, managed to suit the perception of our present needs. Ultimately, revolutionaries promise so much, deliver so little, and strive strenuously and censoriously to obliterate the gap between what is practiced and what was preached. Their horrors carry on in that not so venerable tradition. We don't need to look back as far as the raising to see that it has happened in our own time in relation to the Northern conflict, as was so wittily and subversively captured in the words of Glenn Patterson, that the provisional IRA armed struggle was the war of devolution with the North-South dimension. But yes, there's much fear of the raising, and not just from the usual suspects. What is feared is not the raising per se, but again, to cite Paris, who gets to decide what actually happened yesterday, and then to propagate the tale. It is about who controls the raising. It is not about loyalty to the past raising, but to the present not raising. Pearce's blistering comment that the man who accepts as a final settlement anything less by one fraction of an iota in separation from England is guilty of so immense a fatality, so immense a crime, that it were better for that man that he had not been born. Is not something any of the political elites will be clamouring to remind us of. Invariably, manipulation of the narrative will occur to strangle that sentiment. Through its commemoration of the raising, the state hopes to light the fuse to a damp squib. Because if the squib bangs, they instinctively fear that there will only be one party to benefit, Sinn Féin. The armed activities of a non-representative minority deciding to ignore the views of a wider population seem far too much to resemble the type of thing the Shinners were doing. Best to let that sleeping dog lie if at all possible. If it won't sleep, then make sure that it's had its teeth extracted before wakening it. But to play with words, it is falling rather than raising that is a real potent lesson in 1916. And because of its potency and efficacy as a moral force, it is arguably a real threat from the raising is seen to lie. What was done to the rebels, rather than what the rebels did to others, is what stirred and transformed the popular imagination. If the raising in military terms was something other than a strategic failure, the Brigade OC of the Provisional IRA in Belfast would not have chased Chief of Staff Sean McStephen when he urged that Easter 1970 provided the opportunity to repeat the same. Political violence from below in Western society seems to have so little appeal that the violence of the raising is not what primarily concerns the establishment, given that the chances of it being repeated as a result of commemorations are so slim. There's enough inherited street savvy around to realise that Orwell was hardly far off the mark with his observation that 9 times out of 10 revolutionists are social climbers with bombs. The state fear is not that the IRB's armed Patrick Pearce of the raising made sure the pedestal with the Provisional IRA's Bobby Sands, but that a connect might be made in popular consciousness between Pearce, the unarmed fallen, and Sands, the unarmed fallen. 2 heroic men who showed immense courage and stoicism when they stared into the abyss and refused to blink in the face of a malevolent British power intent on seeing them dead. The moral power flowing from that may just ignite beneath the cosy seat of officialdom a fire that is not viewed by the public as a firebomb. There's another question posed by how we might remember the raising. At the heart of much commemorative culture is the notion of compulsion. Is there no space for the notion of the democratic right to forget, or should we commemorate the raising? How we commemorate the raising be based on the British poppy template, wear it or be damned. Individual citizens should have the right to remember or forget. This confers no right on the state to obliterate or falsify. This ultimately goes to the nature of the nationalism at the heart of the raising, about which a stronger case can be made, that it was of its time rather than having a timeless quality. It seemed blind to any right to dissent from the nation. Should citizens be any more subject to obligatory nationalism than they should be to obligatory religion? Whatever we commemorate the raising for, it is not for its acknowledgement that any nationalism should be respected only insofar as it permits its citizens to dissent from it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony. I think the best thing to do is just to go straight out to the floor, to be honest, because so much has come from these contributions from each of the panellists that the sooner we get discussing them properly, the better. I've quite a lot to say, quite a lot to ask myself, but can I just see a show of hands of people who'd like to ask questions? Please. Thank you.
Yeah, I was going to ask, what kind of agenda do you think, though, just to the panel, there is in terms of commemorating 1916, considering an awful lot of our battlefield areas, such as in Mirror Street or in other areas, are being let go, or they're just being sold. I was just wondering what your thoughts are. Do you think there's an agenda at all or not?
Any other questions? Anybody who wants to
No, I'll start. Well, I won't answer it fully, but what agenda? I'd say doing as much as is kind of absolutely necessary. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it's almost like 66 in a weird way. It's like the government has to be seen to be doing the right thing. They got their acts together after that, whatever it was, video went out. You know, local librarians have been organised. You know, so I think the government is now bowing to what they feel is publicly, you know, they're competing with Sinn Féin, as Anthony's pointed out. They wish to kind of, it's about who owns Republican memory in modern Ireland, and of course all Irish political parties may not want to have much to do with it, but they want to own it, they want to be the most patriotic. So I think that's what the government's doing, picking a kind of careful line, and as you say, rhetorically trying to keep it you know, in keeping with the peace process and getting on with London and big. So they're walking a very complicated tightrope, I think, and they're, you know, and they're probably getting into it at this stage because there's an election as well, and they're kind of enjoying it, you know. So maybe it's kind of going to be like The Gathering in a way.
Any Kevin, any thoughts?
Well, can I steal a point that I heard you make before, Justin, at a Bottle of Ideas?
Oh yeah.
That the dentist chair is the metaphor. You know, it's coming, the centenary, and you know, you have to get on with it and get it over and done with as quickly as possible. And just like going to the dentist, you know, you have to go in and do the business and get out. And I think there's an element of the dentist chair metaphor here. I think, can I think out loud, and I could be on thin ice, but I actually think, you know, after the video and the Shinners are doing their stuff, I actually get the feeling that the politicians in 26 counties, the government, are almost a wee bit pleasantly surprised about how little real pressure there is on them, all things considered, since then. And they're almost embracing the whole idea a little bit more now. And it is about state legitimation, as I mentioned earlier, that they're sort of able to use these commemorations for. So it's a sort of like, it's a little bit fluid in that respect. If you go back and the stuff that Margaret said in the opening speech, you think back to Lamash, you think back to how they used to have to control the 1916 commemorations. At times they really feared the Republican movement, they were a real threat. Remember Charlie Hawke in the 75th anniversary, they wanted to get them into GPO so quick, the dignitaries, the half were locked out. They shut the door, locked half them out because they just wanted to get over it with in 20 minutes. Whereas now there's almost, because the irony of it is that the Republican movement are doing all this stuff in opposition to the government, but actually the Republican movement are not challenging the 26 county state anymore. They're not challenging partition. They're not actually really challenging British rule. They've accepted the Good Friday Agreement. So what's interesting is that there's no real pressure on the government at one level, although that whole Don't Mention the War video certainly made them wise up to the fact that they needed to pay a bit more attention than they did. But since then, if we're judging in the last couple of months, I think they're getting away with it quite all right, really.
Yeah. Anyone else want to?
If you go to Spain, they have regular reenactments of the Christians versus the Moors. Now, you know, talking about, you know, long-standing sensitivities between cultures, you know, that exist between Ireland and England, of course they are there, but they're nowhere near as severe as the Christians and the Moors who spent centuries hacking each other's heads off. Now, you go to any provincial town, say the size of Drogheda in Spain, any given year, you have these huge reenactments going on. Now, they draw thousands of people and they draw tens of thousands of tourists, where you have people, you know, on one side of the city dressing up as Christians, you have on the other side all dressing up as Moors. They all meet in the city centre, they get these blow-up swords, they all go attacking each other, and then they all go and drink beer. It draws humongous amounts of money into local economies. Now, you go to places, again, I mentioned Normandy earlier on, it's a place that I'm very, very familiar with. You go to the famous Omaha beach, the stretch of beach that was made, even more famous by the movie Saving Private Ryan. That 6-kilometre stretch of beach attracts 1.5 million tourists every year. You have other places that are dotted around that coastline that are equally similar. They're equally similarly popular to tourists. Now, I went to a commemoration last Easter Sunday of the famous O'Rahilly charge in Moore Street, where Michael O'Rahilly led a charge into the teeth of enemy machine guns, at the closing stages of the rising. It drew a crowd of about 1,000, but that 1,000, this was done on a shoestring budget. They were completely enthralled. And somebody said to me afterwards, why can't we do this once a month? And
but do we really want to reduce our history? We've kind of done it to Joyce, we've done it to Yeats.
Not at all, not at all.
To reduce everything to kind of kitsch performances?
No, not at all. But I think that there is scope there for performances as a way of introducing people who aren't necessarily predisposed to academic types of history. You can bring people into history through reenactments and through drama. They do it in America with the reenactments of the Civil War. They did it with the Battle of Waterloo this year. This draws people into tourism. A lot of people aren't going to become interested because they happen to walk past a bookshelf in Easton's. You need to get them out there. If there's whatever it is, I'm not saying that that's better than any other form of it, but you have to use everything that's in your arsenal.
For what?
To get people to understand their history, to attract them to their history. Because if they're not attracted to it, they're certainly not going to understand why we should commemorate it.
One of the things that shapes that commemoration, though, because inevitably Conor Cruise O'Brien comes up, and you mentioned the 1976 commemorations, and how between 1966 and 1976, two different attitudes, basically, two different popular attitudes towards the rising have obtained. How long is the shadow of Conor Cruise O'Brien today?
It's not just Conor Cruise O'Brien, though, is he? I mean,
No, I'm using him as a kind of a
I suppose he
example,
articulated something that, if you like, the whole elite in Southern politics eventually, gradually bought into. I mean, a parodic version of it would be the editorial line of the Sunday Independent. But basically, it became the new official line, I suppose, in Dublin. But I mean, you've got to ask, why did it? And I suppose the reason why it did was because, partly legitimately, the Irish state managed to persuade most of the population that this state itself was under threat. It's a whole state-nation argument, isn't it? I mean, the proclamation acts like there's one Irish nation, which is the island of Ireland. And I suppose what the Irish government began to do, well, probably from the 20s, but particularly from the start of the Troubles in '69, in a more exaggerated way, was say, well, what have we got? We've got the Irish state. So the Irish government has primarily been about representing and protecting the Irish state. Now, they've had a second agenda, which is peace in Northern Ireland, but the reason why the text of the proclamation and every aspect of Irish Republican memory is so complex for an Irish government to negotiate, because it opens up that can of worms between the state and the nation. Are Northern Nationalists part of the Irish nation, or aren't they? But I think what Anthony says is true. Concepts of patriotism and the nation have, I suppose, changed a lot in the last century. I mean, sorry, I'm kind of wandering off there, but it's just, I think it's a really difficult issue. And I didn't mean to be sarcastic about acting out battles in Dublin, but I mean, the Moors and the Christians in Spain, and Drogheda, I mean, what are we going to have? You mean...
What I'm saying, I'm just using it for context. It's just for context. It's just to show that how people can be attracted to history by reenactments. Not everybody is going to be drawn to history.
I suppose it's a bitter pill for a lot of people in Northern Ireland, though, on both sides to look at. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whether you're a unionist, whether you're a nationalist, whether you're a disillusioned Republican, either way. Do you know what I mean? Unionists use it as something to be inflamed, irritated and driven mad by.
Yeah.
And different kinds of nationalists in the north, I suppose, are like It's just a very complex issue.
The point that I wanted to make though was in terms of Ireland is scrambling for revenue from tourism. You know, we're approaching 10 million tourists per year. Now again, I'm not trying to degrade this by putting it down as something that should be made into a commodity. I'm not, but you know, these are the facts of life. The
But
government.
is it history for tourists, or is it that
It's history for everybody.
People should understand?
It's history for everybody. It's history for.
But the kind of history that's sold to tourists, is that really?
But that's up to us what we sell.
I'd like to bring up.
Sorry, the pageantry, I think, is something that is only a benefit if it's educational. And the problem with pageantry is it can be used by others, because then you'll have Joe Duffy doing pageants about his 40 dead children. And you can't really suppress him, because you're going to have to say, well, Joe has the right to disagree with us, because a saying of a democracy and a commitment to culture, democratic culture, is the extent to which you are prepared to accept the rights of people against you. Not the rights of people in the abstract, but against you. What rights do people have against you? What rights do people have against Irish nationalism? What rights do people have against republicanism? And for too long, there's been a massive revisionism going on, and not just carried out by the Connor Conto brand, as I call them for long enough, but people of that nature who I thought were dishonest. I don't think there's anything wrong with revisionism in the face of facts, but I do think there's plenty wrong with falsification. And Conor Cruiser-Brand, if you listen to him and you deal with his treatment of Camus, like Conor Cruiser-Brand's condemning Camus for his attitude in Algeria, when Conor Cruiser-Brand actually behaved worse, and him and that other piece of trash, Paddy Cooney, who actually came on and said prisoners have no rights. How they revised the history of this country is terrible, but we also have our own revisionism. The fact that we refuse to acknowledge, we in the IRA, who are in the IRA, refuse to acknowledge that we, not just the British, carried out war crimes, we carried out war crimes. We carried out war crimes against the people of Kingsmill, we carried out war crimes against the disappeared, but suddenly when we do it, it's not a war crime. There's a whole range of issues out there that need to be addressed, and we can't keep putting up the other side and saying, well, you're the revisionists and we're the truth tellers. Because when I look back in Sinn Féin, we are anything but truth tellers.
Very good. Kim?
See, there's a really tricky debate to be had that sort of defies like a quick sort of soundbite, and it's to do with what Anthony, you just said. It's also to do with something you said in your speech, which I thought was interesting. I hope people pick this up. I hope I'm articulate enough to get this across and don't lose you at a level of abstraction. It's to do with when you were quoting Foucault and you were quoting Derrida earlier on, and you're talking about different truths and other truths and effectively who's to tell, you know, is there such a thing as truth? And I've got no doubt, for example, that the IRA, you know, done bad things. If you want to label them war crimes, that's fine by me, like the Kingsmills massacre, etc.
Well, is it or is it
Well,
not?
I'm fine. War crime. I'll take your term. I don't have a problem with that, right? War crime. But here's the point: the IRA struggle in the 6 counties was absolutely a progressive struggle, and it was a struggle worth fighting for, and that's the key point. Now, Joe Duffy absolutely is entitled to come out and have his pageant about the 40 kids that were killed in Dublin during the Easter Rising. There's no problem whatsoever. But the question then is, was the Rising worth waging? And to me, the Easter Rising was absolutely worth fighting for. You see, the logic of this is that you start to challenge the, say, American War of Independence, how America got the freedom, or the French Revolution, as a lot of conservatives do with the terror which came after.
Or resistance.
Exactly.
Well, what freedom-
Yeah, no, but let me just finish the wee point. No, here's the point. The point, Anthony, I'm trying to get at is that you either accept that it's possible to strive for a thing called truth, or you don't. By all means, people can have their different opinions. But what I'm trying to say here is it's very important that what does not get lost in the road that you're going down is that certain things are worth fighting for. And I'm saying that the Easter Rising was worth fighting for, and the war in the 6 counties was worth fighting for.
It's a misrepresentation, in my opinion, or my position. I very much believe there's a truth. I'm not a postmodernist. I mean, I believe that the British soldiers, when they come on to the streets of Derry on Bloody Sunday, committed a war crime against Irish people. If they went into Dublin tomorrow morning, I would ask the people of Dublin, why the fuck are you not out shooting these people? And taking up the cudgel against them. But there is a whole area there that has to be questioned. Was the Rising worth it? Well, the Provisional IRA leadership in Belfast didn't think it was in military terms. Otherwise, they would have took Sean McStephen's advice. They thought it was a disaster, so they told him, fuck off back to Dublin. We don't really want to listen to that because you're going to drive us down. The lesson
Tell
from
us
the Easter
more about
Rising...
McSteeple. I never heard that.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you more about it later, but the whole thing about the Easter Rising that I think is missed out on here. I mean, I discovered this when I was in jail for the Hates Blacks, and it came to me, and at the time I was also reading Helder Camara, a Brazilian archbishop, and I'm not a pacifist by any stretch. I think pacifism is a moral cop-out. But I think this is that the Provisional IRA was at its most powerful, not when it was killing people, but when it was getting killed or when it was making sacrifices and making major inroads, major moral inroads into the consciousness of the people on this island. And it wasn't the Rising that motivated people on this island. It was the stoicism, the heroism, the standing up against the British and saying, fuck you, shoot me. Now there's a lot to be learned from that as about how violence, political violence, should only be used as an alternative. Let's accept the Rising and say, yes, it was right, but let's not start glorifying it, and let's never ask people to repeat it so that they may go out and end up in graves so we can stand celebrating them and commemorating them and talking bollocks about the sacrifices that they made. Because, see the day, the human species, somebody pointed out earlier about killing, I think it was Derry pointed out about, we'll kill for ideas and we'll kill about differences. The majority of deaths that happen, as Derek again pointed out, are needless and not fucking worth it. And the IRA and everybody else in Ireland needs to realise that there has to be ways of challenging the British where we don't send out people, not for good strategic reasons, but so other people can sit back in the fucking shadows and feel psychologically good and get political careers out of it. It's a waste of human life. It's a waste of youth. Bobby Sands would have been much better had he been a volunteer in St Vincent de Paul rather than a volunteer in the Provisional IRA. He'd have made a difference in terms of eradicating human suffering and human misery. And I can say that from the perspective of having shared that protest with them. It gives me no advantage over you or anybody else in terms of argument. I have to make the intellectual argument is the same. But in my view, was the Provisional IRA worth it? Campaign worth it? A waste of time. I don't regret what happened to me, but I do regret what we've done to other people, and particularly the people that we committed war crimes against and the rights of people that we denied those rights to.
We do actually have a few hands here. What I'd like to do is take people's questions, not individually, but groups of questions, and then we come back to the panel and they can answer any or all. So can I see your hands again, please? We do actually have a mic there, which is it's on a cord, right? I don't know why we don't have it. This could be interesting now, getting that back there. But anyway, we'll try. Is that going to work? This is going to be working together now. Let's see how this works. Actually, you know what, Maria? If you don't mind, I don't think this is going to work. So if you just stand up.
Just ask the question would be between commemoration, nationalism, and citizenship, because this debate will go on while we have issues around direct provision, as we said, immigration, migrants, asylum in this country, and it seems to me it's very, as we said, not Irish against sort of white identity, but talks about nationalism, but not about the idea of the nation state at the moment in a very contemporary sense. And there is something that maybe needs to be addressed there, and if anybody had any thoughts on it.
Thank you. Other hands? This lady here.
I was very interested to hear you, now I've forgotten your name.
Kevin?
Kevin mentioned that that you thought there was no moral equivalency between the people who went out to fight in World War I from Ireland and those who fought in 1916. And again, all history is revisionist in the sense that you look at history from where you're at, and you look at the evidence and you make up your mind, and it's very easy in the modern world when you're so informed by other things to change your view of things. But one thing, and this goes back to the guy beside you, Mr. Molyneux up next, about what you said about pageantry. The reason I thought I was interested in your comment was because for the first time in my whole life I realised what war is about. simply because I went to an enactment in it was called ANU, the company, and they did a thing about World War I in Collins's barracks.
Yeah.
And it was about some young fellas in Dublin who signed up. Now, they were privileged kids. They were mostly, you know, people in Trinity or in college, whatever, right? They weren't involved in the lockout. They weren't starving, right? But they signed up in the kind of like in a big kind of hoopla, thinking we're going to go and, you know, save the world. And they had no fucking idea what they were getting into. And they were blown to pieces in Gallipoli. But contrast those young men and the call that they answered, that they thought they answered. It was actually an IRFU call. They headed down to Lansdowne Road and were recruited. Compare that to the other guys who were brought in to World War I, who were trying to feed their families after being locked out, who had starving children, who had absolutely no way of doing anything. And can you say that that's a moral equivalency? Is the moral obligation not on a man to feed his family? Or is it a higher moral order to die for your country? Do you know what I'm saying? So I think when you're talking about moral equivalency, you've got to set everybody's decisions within what their framework is. And if the only way to feed your family was to join the army, so be it. If you thought and you were sold the idea that joining the army was to save the world, so be it. But to say that there is moral equivalency in these two choices, I think is a moot point. That's
Okay.
just my opinion.
Thank you. James.
I don't like the sacrifice word because it's got a moral, religious connotation, like you know, sacrificing a goat. And I think it's a bit unpleasant, really, to mean that. And I think it gets to this point that we were talking about. And I like what Kevin says about equivalent happening. Obviously, I like it. We elaborate, aren't we? But I think it's an important thing to say that there's an equality if we talk in suffering. You know, somebody who's well, Peter Novick, a historian of the Holocaust, made this point very well. He was interviewed and he was talking to this guy, and he said, the guy's a soldier, and he said, you had to be there, Peter, to understand the suffering. And Novick is telling the story, and he says, of course, the man was in the Waffen SS, and he was surrounded by Bolsheviks at the time who were determined to exterminate them. And he said, I could understand his point, you know. His suffering was the same as everybody's. I just couldn't sympathise with it because I didn't want the same outcome that he wanted. He didn't identify with the Waffen SS determination to destroy the Soviet peoples as they imagined them. And so he understood the suffering was the same. And I think that's important to say because it's right. You know, when we talk about victims of atrocities, all victims of atrocities, the suffering is heartbreaking and grotesque, and it tells us why we should, whenever we can, try and find political solutions whenever we can. But there is a difference. I think there is a difference between the goals of the First World War, which we can examine. You know, we can think about, you know, was gallant Belgium a righteous cause? Can we think, was it truly about the rights of small nations, as the English recruiting officers said? Or was it, as I think most people understand in the retrospect, a terrible, monstrous human sacrifice for no worthy cause at all? Then we have to look at the rising. Well, I don't know. I mean, was it worth it? It's hard to say because you can't ever know. You know, there isn't an alternate history. We can't, well, there's no experiment possible here. I think the evidence suggests that Britain wouldn't have given up very much at all in the mood that it was in 1919 to any national movement whatsoever. But I don't think that, I can't, you know, it's true that what happened was that people were executed, and that became the focal point of a great sympathetic feeling. But I'm pretty sure that wasn't what anybody set out to do. I mean, I can't think that there was, oh yeah, Connolly be up there thinking, when they shoot me in the chair, then we'll win the argument. I don't think that was it. I think it was much more, I mean, it was a conscious decision about he talks about it, that people were disappearing from Dublin every day, possibilities were shrinking all the time, and it feels desperate. Often it feels desperate. But if you think of it in the world historical context, that all of the Socialist International, all of the freedom-loving peoples had said we will strike against war when it comes. This is the only case that or the first case that it happens, and it was an inspiration. I'm not saying it was the only inspiration, but there's a reason why Lenin looked at 1916 and corrected those people who wanted to call it a putsch. It was the first real breach. It was the first revolt against the colonial powers that were waging war. And it's not remembered as much as the Bolshevik Revolution because in its character it was less socialistic. It didn't have that universalizing current that those other ones did. But it did, nonetheless, I think it's the beginning of the end of the First World War. That is a noble cause.
I think it's the beginning of the end of the British Empire, even more noble because.
Okay.
It also put the brakes on recruitment in Ireland in no small way, and in doing so saved the lives of thousands.
People have their hands up, keep them up, because we'll come back out again, but I want to come back to the panel, because those are three quite rich and detailed contributions. Andy, you want to come in?
Well, briefly, because of the time factor, but I mean, in response to the first speaker, I mean, I think the difference in my view, and I've written about this before, between republicanism and nationalism, is that republicanism tends to be inclusive of citizenry, whatever way you pronounce it, and that nationalism can be very exclusive, that it includes the people that are Irish and excludes the rest of them. Whereas a republicanism would be much more embracive and it would concentrate on the citizens of the country. The second point is, I think the second speaker was right about the horrors of war. I mean, and if war is so horrible, then why don't we find reasons to avoid it, rather than to go down the road of physical force republicanism and venerate and find reasons to fucking wage it. And this leads me on to the third point, and I go back to one of Kevin's points, the third speaker there, and I take it you're not a Trotskyist. The third speaker there made the point about the horrors of war and everything else, and he's right, and you need to understand context, and there is no equivalence. I've made the point before, how can we equate the rifle that Frank Hughes shot the SAS men with the weapons of the bloody Sunday murderers? We should decommission the bloody Sunday weapons and put up on a pedestal the weapon that Frank Hughes used to kill that SAS guy. But to go back to Kevin's point about the reason and the people opposed to barbarism, not all of them were. Pierce opposed to barbarism. Was he fuck? He argued and he put the point about the battlefields of Europe need warm with a fucking blood. What a head case. What a fucking absolute lunatic who Connolly, and I go with Connolly, is called a blathering idiot for that point. That's not venerate people when they don't need venerate, and that's have the courage to stand up and dissent from the men in 1916 if we think they were wrong in certain points. And Pierce was certainly wrong in that.
Yeah. Kim?
Well, first of all, for what it's worth, I try to stand in the tradition of Connolly. Obviously, we're 100 years later, and politics is context, is exactly what you say, and you have to take your politics from where it's at. But it's interesting about the small equivalence. By the way, just it is going off on the side, but I just wanted to say it loud back to Anthony. Massive respect for him. Massive respect. But I absolutely just wanted to come back on one point. I absolutely think that the IRA struggle of the last 30 years was absolutely worth fighting, and I defend it 100%.
Are we talking about 1916?
No, but I just want to come back, and as Bernadette McCoskey said, the good guys lost, but I just wanted to put that on record. Just on the moral equivalence thing in the war, which this woman raised, the thing about it is, there's a great historian in Belfast, Jimmy McDermott. He tells a great story in his book about Connolly, where he was in the Royal Avenue, which is the main street in Belfast, and where he was trying to argue against the war, the First World War, and basically get kicked and punched and chased because most of the people were for the war. They were Protestant workers, they were for it. and there were others, you know, who were following Redmond. He was punched and kicked and chased, and he said, you know, you're going out to kill your fellow human beings, and la 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 la. He was making the point. Now, the argument that I want to put forward, and I realise it's a very difficult one, is that people do have, no matter what the circumstances, possess agency, and you have free will, and you have choice. And the point about Easter Rising, and Anthony's right, that not every single volunteer that went in had the same desire as an awful lot of the others, to use the Rising as an attempt to challenge the barbarism in the First World War. But it is very important to put on record the Easter Rising, followed by the revolutions in Germany and Russia, did eventually bring an end to the First World War. And so what you actually had with Easter Rising, which is neglected to a large extent, is the fact that the Easter Rising contributed to the end of that barbarism where people were being killed in their tens and tens of thousands. And there becomes a problem, you see, because what you're getting at the moment is politicians in the south of Ireland going up, meeting unionists and go, let's, you know, celebrate our shared suffering. It was terrible what happened. Let's go over together. At least we all fought together, Irishmen and unionists, in the Somme or wherever, and they go over to Belgium and they have these anniversaries, and it's presented in the media as a look at the reconciliation, peace and understanding. And in the book, in page 73, we actually, you know, just pick up on one of these. It's one of Fine Gael TDs goes over one of the unions, the Mezzanine Ridge, where the UVF battalion and the sort of Irish battalion fought together. And they're going, well, it's great that Irishmen were together at this, so we could have shared remembrance. Now, what they actually did was, they put one of these, forget the name of the explosives.
Mines.
But massive one, right? And they put it under the German lines, and they blew it up. And as the Germans were you know, dying, they then rattled them, riddled them, and out of those 10,000 Germans, there was something like about 70 survivors.
The explosion was heard in London.
Thank you. The only point I'm trying to make here is that's the reality of the, you know, sort of like moral equivalence. That's shared remembrance for you. And the point, hold on, let me just finish this one sentence.
My point is that
I think that there are certain causes worth fighting for that are morally superior to others, and I stand by that.
Can I just say something? Apropos of the point the woman was making, which was, does a man who's been locked out, who is, you know, needs the money to go and join up to, I think your position is ludicrous to kind of morally condemn someone in that position.
But just because they're not...
Yeah, and they're not equivalent.
There's no equivalence. And
and the point is, I don't think hatred, which you keep saying, you know, I mean, I think the 1916 Rising was a good idea, but I think if it was for anything, and first of all, you keep lauding it, but you keep saying it's so useless because this state is so terrible, and you know the IRA campaign was so brilliant and it hasn't won. But I mean, if it was for anything, to go back to what Anthony said, surely it was about some kind of freedom. And so I don't think hating people really helps. And I suppose if we've learned anything, I mean, you know, there are about 1 million people who are unionist. It is difficult in terms of the idea that Irish Republicans or nationalists have about the future that they want for this island, to know how to deal with that. So hatred probably isn't a good approach. I mean, maybe people have confused positions. It is a difficult situation to think through. Apropos of what the woman at the back said about, you know, different people, migrant communities, I also agree with Anthony, because republicanism is about, in theory, and I think often in practice in the past in Ireland, about, you know, those who choose to give of themselves to the place. Or we abolished by referendum a few years ago the right to birth in Ireland automatically, making you Irish. But I mean, republicanism, Irish republicanism, is potentially a resource for thinking through creative ways of thinking about equality in the present. And on the kind of, was 1916 a good or a bad idea at the time, I've been reading a lot of letters between Alice Stopford Green and Casement and other people in that period. And Casement is interesting because he's anti-imperial, actually he's not quite anti-German imperial, but he's quite anti-imperial in an international context. And one thing that really strikes you is how a lot of the people in that generation feel if they don't strike a blow do something there and then. If you look at, say, what someone like Tom Clark is saying, they actually really believe that Ireland is kind of on the brink of being fully absorbed into the British Empire. And I think that's a really interesting way to look at 16 in a way, because I think if 16 hadn't happened, I think, you know, what would it have been like at the end of the war? And I think the war itself was kind of pushing to absorb Ireland more successfully into the United Kingdom. And Paul Bew's very interesting on this. You know, like a lot of people in Ireland were quite happy within the UK. Okay, Home Rule was the fact that it wasn't happening was a big disappointment, but what Home Rule was being shrunken all the time anyway. So I don't think, even if you'd got a kind of Home Rule Ireland after the war, it certainly wouldn't have been anything like the kind of society, which maybe wasn't that great, that we did get after 20.
I know you want to come back briefly and then I come back.
Okay, look, there's so much to pick up on there, and let me just be clear about the hatred thing. The hatred thing, funny enough, comes from an article that Roy Foster made quite eloquently, and the point that he's making is that conflicts involve hatred and antagonisms, whether it be hatred of partition or hatred of imperialism, etc., etc., etc. So that was the point that was making. But let me just pick up one point. So I'm not going to say that any of your points are ludicrous. But here, there is a really good disagreement between us, because you see, lots of other people who were hungry chose not to go and fight in a British uniform in the First World War, and really, the debate boils down to a difference between Margaret and I about judgmentalism or non-judgmentalism. And what I'm saying is that I want the right, and I think is important in the discussion, for people to be able to make judgments about what people did in certain situations and in certain conflicts. That's my point. That's why I told the story about Connolly when he was trying to argue against the war.
Well, you're just saying it's better to die beneath an Irish sky than in Suvla or Glenelg Bar. Well, we might all agree with that.
Can I just come back again? Let me just say this one more time. You can be, we can be flippant or we can be whatever, but we're about to hit next Easter when it's the centenary of the Rising. And here's the question, is it the case that those people in Ireland who wore a British uniform and fought with Britain in the interest of imperialism or colonialism should be judged on an equal footing with those Republicans who went out trying to fight for Irish independence and also trying to challenge
What about those who joined the British Army
point
for independence?
I just want to bring Derek in because
what about those who joined the British Army because, in 1914 because they were Republicans and they thought they considered it pragmatic that if a division was being formed in Northern Ireland that we would eventually have to fight. If they had proper military training with combat experience, what are we going to do? Go out against them with hurley sticks and pitchforks? There was a very big cohort of Irishmen who joined the British Army in 1914 for the purpose of getting combat experience so that they wouldn't have their arses kicked when the whole show was finished. They didn't realise it was going to go on as long. My own great-grandfather he joined the Royal Irish Regiment. Now, as far as I know, he joined up because he needed to put food on the table. I don't think any of us is fit to sit 100 years later and judge them any more than we're in a position to condemn those who ran into the GPO and elsewhere in Dublin. I think that was an excellent point that you made.
You wouldn't question, say, Nazi concentration camp guards, for example?
No, I think that's completely ludicrous. I think they were psychopaths. I think that's a complete difference. Somebody who joins an army, who's in fairness, who's hoodwinked into joining an army because he wants to feed his family. But hoodwinked they were. But I don't think that they should stand accused of being morally...
We're not saying they have to be celebrated on a par with those who fought in the GPO, but we don't have to condemn them. Is that the...
I think they should be remembered. I think everybody should be remembered in that regard. I don't think that it's fair to just, as a sweeping statement, to condemn anybody who lived in the slums of Gloucester Street for wanting to feed his family. I don't think, some people did, some people didn't, but who is fit to judge who?
I'm going to stop you there. There's still some questions from the floor. Can we show the hands again? Do you mind standing up and speaking quite loud? Because
speak quite loud from down here.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
I'd like to say that I am more than somewhat alarmed at how it has veered off. And one of the things I would have hoped for is that we could manage to discuss the 1916 Rising now outside the frame of the North and the issues there, because there are so many interesting things in it, one of the things that you will have, I'm sure, watched closely is the row to do with the Abbey Theatre and the gender exclusion. You must be very grateful to Margaret escaped by, we were collecting the panels that are all male panels at the moment, so you know. But the shocking thing, if those of you who don't know, the Abbey have released their Waking the Nation. A lot of us are going to sleep at the list, but they managed to exclude women completely. There are newly commissioned plays, no female writers, hardly any parts for women in it, and it has caused a huge row. And I think that the militaristic, with all due respect, is a problem as well, because it's adding to masculisation of the event as well. You know, so if you commemorate, and even the comparisons with who fought what, we're again talking men here. And I think that that's problematic. Because if you were looking at the contemporary world, like Hannah Sheehy, Skeffington and people like that, were trying to stop the rape of women in service and them losing their jobs and everything else. And the gender issues were interesting from the point of view of what's occurring in Ireland constitutionally. Like we have repealed the 8th as well, you know. So I think that for us it's a hope that we could have look at 1916, you know, without the shame of, you know, supposedly the offence of having, and I think there's a real problem, the returned conscript, you know, the whole discourse of the First World War, the poppy fascism, stops people actually engaging with the many very interesting things. I noticed when you mentioned Pádraig Pearse there, well, Pearse is very interesting as well. I mean, the murder machine alone, as it stands, as up there with Césaire and that. So I just put it to the panel, what do they think about the Abbey debate and about the issue of gender and commemoration?
Thank you. This gentleman back here.
Thanks. A lot of stuff, and I'm not too sure it might wander all over the place. Quick response maybe to the Abbey debate.
So do you mind speaking up a bit?
Yeah, I'll speak up. Sometimes if I speak too loud, it might feel I'm shouting or something like that.
No, don't.
Anyway,
you're in good company anyway.
Quick response to the Abbey debate. I didn't follow it, I wasn't aware, I was just involved in other things. But unfortunately, I think it's aspects of it which are clear, you know, of the disparity between the men and women involved as playwrights and so on. But it's almost the Abbey gets 70% of the budget, and yet it speaks as a kind of a national institution, which is hugely problematic in itself. It doesn't now tour very much across the country, it doesn't have much engagement, it has some community in Dublin. It's predominantly, you know, as the arts predominantly are, middle class activity. And some of these things were mentioned, but they weren't, and how decision is made in relation to all what happens in the arts, hugely problematic. And to me, because I have some personal experiences, some people who spoke, actually I felt excluded by, and directly. So, and that they actually are working within the system as it is. While there was some mention of that, that needs to be all brought out, and there is a certain, you know, you could say, culture of silence to some degree going on.
Okay.
So just qualifications in relation to that. Some very quick things, just in relation to the Moors and Christians. Like I was in Barcelona and Catalonia in the 80s and so on. That very much the Civil War and so on, or Civil War, the Republic wasn't talked about. It was too still problematic, and I presume that's still the case. Reaction to 1916, the Rising. I don't think it was just a reaction to the executions. The issue of conscription united a lot of people in response, and there was also a lot of news coming back of the terrible brutality and killings and bodies coming back slowly that changed people's view of the war and also towards sympathy for the Rising. most things, areas of life can be looked at in lots of different, it depends on your position, class-wise, gender-wise, historic-wise, where you're at in your life, how you're going to respond to any particular event or situation. Generally, I mean, I'm Russian now, generally it would be...
Sorry, I have to do it.
I would say like partition and the fact that a whole section of people who consider themselves Irish were excluded into another oppressive state is hugely problematic. But when it comes down to it, I do have a huge problem with violence because it has its own momentum and dynamic, and it may not address the issues. And the challenge is for anybody is to how can we address the issues without using violence, and that's a bigger challenge to how you do that. I don't think that in either cases, while I would feel that people in the Rising were justified by most standards internationally for using violence, but I still wouldn't have, personally, where I am at the moment, I still wouldn't have gone along with it. And
Bingo, thank you.
In the north,
I'll have to stop you there, sorry. Because I just want to ask one quick question as well, based on something that Kevin has said, and you've mentioned a couple of times about the idea of moral agency.
Yeah.
To what extent can you see what ambivalence there is about rising commemorations in, you know, through the lens of diminished agency, or an idea of diminished moral agency today? Or is that even a valid approach?
That is a brilliant question, and it's a really, really, really brilliant question, because the thing that I wrestle with and is the fact that I do think that people do possess the ability to make choices and decisions, even when they're hungry, even when they're being ground down by the drudgery of life. And I think that it's very important to hold on to the fact that people possess free will and the ability to make moral choices, even when their material circumstances and social circumstances are dire. Because I think if you lose that, if you lose faith in the capacity of an individual to be sovereign over themselves and to self-determine their own future, then I don't think you've got any chance of having politics as we know it. Because politics, I think, comes from individuals having a sense of themselves and the capacity to be able to act upon the world. And you know, I hear Margaret and I hear other people, but you know, if I've come across as ludicrous or a cold-hearted bastard, you know, I'm sorry. I actually genuinely didn't mean to come across like that, but I do.
Nobody said you were ludicrous.
Yeah, no, but I do. All right, sorry, okay.
Yeah.
But the point is, I really, you know, do believe passionately in what I'm saying. I could be wrong, but you know, for what it's worth, I think I'm right. It's really a moral. It's a moral judgment that I'm trying to make, because I think today, in certain ways, not a lot is expected of people at one level, at the individuals. There's all sorts of excuses put forward for why they acted in the way they did, or why they couldn't act in a particular way. And I know that life can be hard and severe and all the rest of it, but your question is a really, really good question, and it's something I've been wrestling with quite a bit, because it's almost as if when I look at Ireland today, north and south, and politics are not where I would like them to be. And I'm trying to work out, you know, in my mind, how could you reconstitute politics in Ireland? And it might be that the direction of politics in the future has to look beyond the national question, has to look beyond partition, and maybe the main issue that we might need to take up now is free speech, for example, or you know, abortion, or free expression. I'm not quite sure, but those types of issues, because politics seems to be revolving around those sorts of moral issues. Concern individuals, and I wonder might those types of questions around the individual's moral choices be the basis of how we maybe reconstitute a new form of politics as we go forward. However, I'm on thin ice because I'm thinking out loud.
Moral agency is always circumscribed and constrained by situational logic. You know, and I'm very, very suspicious about moralising arguments, because the people in power quite often make them. When the Catholic Church had power, the woman who made a moral decision to have an abortion was a scumbag and a lowlife. That's just pretty okay, because the real bastards, the immoral bastards, the priests and the bishops, they don't have the power any longer, and the woman can make the decision. Louis Althusser, the French philosopher, there may be much good that people say. Pardon?
Not here or north.
No, in the
not
sense,
here
yeah,
or
well, they're
north.
severely limited. You're quite right. They're severely limited, but they can make the decision a hell of a lot better
To
than
make the
previously
decision
could.
to go to England.
And secondly,
Well,
the point,
That's about it.
the point, it's not a nice choice. The point that I want to raise is Louis Althusser, the French philosopher, summed up the argument of moral agency very well when he asked the question, do people believe in God or do people believe in God and then fall down and pray as a result of believing in God? Or do they fall down and pray and then believe in God? What shapes what? I think the circumstances always shapes your morality. As Fintan O'Toole said recently, the woman or man who goes out and steals to put food on her table for the starving child is not a criminal. He would do it. Other people in power, freedoms, not under the same pressures, will make a different choice and tell you that's their morality. Be very, very suspicious of people. Never let the laws have morality for you.
Derek, anything you want to come back on?
No, I pretty much agree with yourself there on that one. I mean, I think just going back to the topic at hand, and in relation to the Irishman who joined the British Army, there was a myriad of reasons why men joined the British Army in 1914. And I mentioned earlier on, some of them were to feed their families, but a quite important and often forgotten reason was because they foresaw this conflict with Unionists in Northern Ireland, and they wanted to have military training themselves. Now, that wasn't a huge cohort, but it certainly was a cohort. There were also men who joined the British Army because they were nationalists. They were hoodwinked by John Redmond into going and doing that. I mean, Home Rule was already there, famously on the statute books, but he still urged them to go and do this. And these were young, some of them didn't have families, some of them were young, they were young men and they wanted adventure, and this was 100 years ago, and that's what a lot of them did, in those circumstances. So I personally, my own philosophy is, like I said, I don't do politics and I don't do condemnation of people whose circumstances I have no understanding of, and I think it's very wrong to do that. But equally, and I think that to do that, you're as guilty as those who sit on one side of the fence and sling mud at James Connolly. I'm not going to mention the gentleman involved, but a couple of years ago I heard a comment saying that they should rename the hospital in Blanchardstown because it's named after a psychopath. I mean, I think that's a ridiculous thing to say. But equally, that's just, again, it's a broad mud shot at it doesn't make any sense.
Can I just say one thing? I think a woman in the audience asked the whole panel to comment upon gender and the question of gender.
Yeah, excellent point. Sorry.
I don't think anybody has done that.
I've actually meant to come back to that when he said it. Sorry about that.
So I will respond a little.
I'll go after you if that's okay.
The whole Abbey thing. Well, I mean, it's kind of typical. I remember when the Field Day anthology came out, and I was quite pro the Field Day anthology. But Seamus Dean was going on about exclusion in the North and exclusion of nationalist men, and he was told, well, women were completely now excluded from the canon of Irish writing, and he just said, oh, I forgot. And what McAneil has basically said today is, oh, I really need to go and check myself because I forgot. And that's just the point. They do kind of forget all the time. And I think because, and like forgetting history and commemoration are different things, but both involve what you choose to forget and what you choose to remember. Okay, we hope, history attempts to remember more than commemorating does, okay? But forgetting about women is just an automatic reflex attitude.
But I think it's very much a feature of republicanism in this last 100 years. The Easter Rising didn't have one woman in the Irish, the Revolutionary Council, and secondly, the Provisional IRA Army Council, which I've studied over the years, had an attitude of not a woman about the place.
Okay, I don't know anything about the Provisional IRA. If you want to go back to 1916, indeed. If you go back to 1916, women generally were not directing military operations in many locations.
They were heavily involved in them.
In 1916, but there were a lot. Actually, I'm launching a book on Wednesday, a woman called Lucy McDermott who's writing a book called At Home in the Revolution, or has written a book called At Home in the Revolution. So loads of women were involved. We can see what they have to say from the Bureau of Military History witness statements. people like Alice Stopford Green were highly influential Republican ideologues before the Rising. The fact that the proclamation itself declares the rights of Irish men and Irish women. The fact that Markievicz was the first woman elected to the British House of Commons, though she never took her seat. I mean, it's not that there are no stories of women, there are loads of stories of women there. But maybe the kind of states that emerged north and south were, you know, Protestant reactionary predominantly in the north and Catholic reactionary in the south. And both of them, you know, there was that programme about a week or two ago that looked at social attitudes north and south on abortion and same-sex marriage, and they're pretty identical to two very patriarchal conservative societies, and that's why even people born in the 1960s, like McAneill, generally forget about women. I'm sure the provisionals were highly sexist, but the society's highly sexist too.
Thanks.
I mean, I apologise for the whole militaristic aspect, but that's just where I come from with my historical studies. But just to, I'll get a plug for my own book as well. I mean, there's several women that we deal with in the book, and it's to do with their contributions to the combat that took place. I mean, you had Margaret Skinner, she's a 23-year-old school teacher who travelled from Glasgow to take part in the rebellion. She took out half a dozen or so enemy soldiers. You had Josie O'Keefe from Cumbernauld, who in the Marrowbone Lane distillery, she loaded the rifles of Robert Holland, who was a crack sharpshooter. Now, he would have had a Mauser at one stage, he would have been shooting a single shot out of that, he would have handed it to her, she would have handed him an Enfield, he would have fired off a 10-round magazine, then she would have handed him something else. Now, she was equally exposed to the same enemy fire that he was. The Cumbernauld in the GPO, the same thing applies. The women had a first aid station in Hoyt's Oil Works. They abandoned that shortly before the place turned into a blast furnace. Women were heavily involved. That's even before we get to the more well-known figures such as Countess Markievicz. So I think it's a very good point, and I think it's something that should equally be celebrated.
I'm going to have to...
Can I just say one thing on the...
Can you make a part of your concluding remark?
All right, fair enough.
Okay, because I want to actually... the title of your and James' book... What this has shown is how vexed the issue of commemoration is. I mean, that's what this discussion in many ways was about, as it should be. But I wanted, as a way of kind of getting the panel to round off with their concluding remarks, I want to actually take the title of James and Kevin's book and ask, in light of everything that we've heard this evening and in light of everything that we see going on around us, who's afraid of the Easter Rising? Anybody want to start?
Everybody that can't control it, and includes the whole lot. Every Republican generation venerates Easter and then turns on the inheritors of Easter in their own time.
Kevin?
Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, Labour, and in an interesting way, Sinn Féin now, also. So that's that. I've lost my thread, but I did want to come back to your Margaret Skinner point's interesting, because I was up at a Celtic game about 2 weeks ago in Glasgow. I was in the pub, and there were a few women there, and there were and guys actually wearing the Margaret Skinner t-shirt, and the t-shirt says "Teacher, Feminist, Republican, Sniper." And it's just interesting because you don't want to fetishise violence or militarism, but at the same time you don't want to just say that violence and militarism is just something associated with men. Women have absolutely played their part.
I just want to say that's not my point.
Struggle.
My point is that in constructing
this
dialogue about the First World War is creating a problem for us engaging in 1916 from a different perspective. So I just want to explain that. So I do know the history of military engagement of women in 1916, but that if the because you were proposing reenactments, I think. So I want to say that's what I meant by it.
Are these the closing remarks, Justin?
Yeah, they are.
Just a final thing then, just a very final thing. I hope that one of the things that comes out of the centenary celebrations is that we can open it up, even if we disagree. We can open it up as a site of struggle, as a site of debate and disagreement. That we can talk about things which some people might not want to talk about, like the elephant in the room, which is partition. Might it be that we have to leave that behind? Might it be that it's unrealistic to think of a 32-county independent Ireland? I want there to be a bit of space that we can look back on the different groups of people that were involved in the Rising, and I know that they came in different hues. I want to look at the politics of people like Connolly and what they stood for, what the proclamation stood for, and whether or not it's realistic in 2016 that we can take those ideas and make them our own today. And I suppose I really want to ask the question in 2016, what does freedom look like today? What does freedom mean? And what would be the shape of a radical and progressive politics from here on in? And to what extent, if any, do we need to look to the past in 1916 to get our route map? Or do we need to try to invent a completely new type of politics for the period that we're in? And final sentence, that's why I think your point that you asked me about the individual and about morality and individual self-determination is quite interesting, because it's trying to grapple with the agency that an individual can possess and able to in terms of trying to act upon the world themselves, but also the social context in which they find themselves, and the relationship between those two, and trying to work out how you might break new ground towards a progressive, different type of politics.
Thank you. Barbara?
I just think it would be good if it got people to look at the period and think about the people of the period, I suppose, in their own context. But it's a slightly naive aspiration, because it's very hard to think about the past in its own terms and not want on some level to make it apply to the present. But I think that there are a lot of very interesting people, there are a lot of very interesting stories. I think we should explore them, we should examine them. It's an important, I think it's dangerous not to explore your own history, but you can't deny that history is also a resource, and it is a resource for people who want to affect change in the present. So maybe the needs or the desires of someone who says they're a historian, if there's such an objective being, and somebody who's an activist are kind of different. Okay? But that's about it.
Thank you. Derek?
Who's afraid of the Easter Rising? I'm not sure, to be honest with you. Politics and that isn't really my thing, but I think it could quite possibly be argued that those who claimed the legacy of 1916, in 1922, I think 1922 was seen as an opportunity for the elite and the connected in Ireland to circle their wagons and make sure that they were okay, and that everybody who was outside the circle, stayed where they were. And I think that's led to, some real serious trauma in Irish society that we've learned about over the past, couple of decades. But I think that the same, conservatism is absolutely terrified, not just of the Easter Rising, but of history in general, where people can have their own identities through their history. I mean, last year or the year before, it was suggested that they wanted to make history a voluntary subject in secondary schools, but I think that's absolutely ludicrous. History, I've often, asked myself about this, what is it about history that's so fascinating? And, then I'd say to myself, for God's sake, that was hundreds, thousands of years ago. What the hell has it got to do with it about now? You ask a geologist what a mountain range that was formed 100 million years ago has to do with now, and they'll tell you exactly why it has to do with now, because it formed the world that we live in. And that's what our history is, and I think we should embrace it. But again, just to go back to the question, I think those who are afraid of the Easter Rising and who are afraid of our history are those who are trying to twist our present and our future for their own ends.
Thank you. Anthony?
I just comment when I was forced to comment. So,
It's finished.
yeah, that's over, yeah.
Grand. Okay. Yeah. Well, it just goes to show how much more there is to talk about and how much more there is to say. That's what pubs are for. That's my suggestion. There's a couple of things before we wrap up completely. I just want to first of all thanks everybody for coming. It's great to see so many of you here. Much better than the football, I hope. I want to thank Neil and everybody at CCT for letting us use the facilities here. I'm very grateful to them. They've been very good and very supportive for everything that we've done and put on so far. go onto our website, dublinsalon.org, to look for our next event, which is going to be in the spring. Don't know what it is yet. I forgot to mention at the outset that the tweet thing was hashtag Battle of Ideas. I hope people more savvy than me have been doing that, but not to worry if not. I'm rambling now. We have to go. I just want to say it's been a very, very lively and interesting and necessarily difficult discussion, and it underlines something that Kevin said about the importance of free speech and free debate, and that's what Dublin Salon is all about. So thank you for coming to this event. Please come to our next one. Most importantly of all, please show your appreciation for our panel.